I'm sorry, Mr. Briggs, but there's a temporary hold on your account due to internal security protocols. We can't process any transactions at this time. The teller said, not even looking up. Walter Briggs, 79. A retired Army sergeant gripped the counter. His pension had just been deposited, money he urgently needed for his wife's medication. Security protocols on a pension, he asked, trying to stay calm. The teller slid a useless pamphlet across the counter. Minutes later, Walter sat alone on the lobby bench, defeated. Then the glass doors opened. A man in a dark suit stormed in, sharp, focused, furious. It was Graham Kessler, CEO of the entire bank. He locked eyes with Walter, then turned toward the manager's office without saying a word. Everyone went silent. Walter Briggs wasn't the kind of man who made noise. He didn't brag about his rank or retell war stories for attention. But those who knew him, the few close friends he still had, understood one thing clearly. This man had given his entire life to service. Over 30 years in the U.S. Army, most of it spent far from home in harsh terrain, behind logistics lines that never made headlines but were the lifelines of combat units. He rose through the ranks with quiet precision, eventually retiring as a senior master sergeant. Not because he craved leadership, but because others trusted him to do things right without fuss or ego. Now in his late 70s, Walter lived in a small one-bedroom apartment just outside town. It wasn't much: beige walls, secondhand furniture, and a kitchen that squeaked, but it was clean, organized, and paid for. He shared it with Elaine, his wife of 42 years, whose battle with advanced COPD had turned their once active days into a carefully choreographed routine of medications, oxygen tanks, and frequent doctor visits. Walter never complained. He simply adjusted. That's what soldiers do. Every penny of his pension had a destination. Rent, electricity, medications, groceries, in that order. There were no luxuries, no vacations, no new clothes unless something wore out. He clipped coupons, checked pharmacy discounts, and even bought used books from thrift stores instead of television. He knew the VA couldn't cover everything, especially the newer medications Elaine needed to breathe comfortably, and so he made up for it with discipline, the same kind he used to keep a field unit running in a war zone. What made Walter different wasn't just his military background. It was the way he carried that past into his present. Even now, he rose at 5:30 every morning, not because he had to, but because routine brought clarity. He made the bed with military precision, laid out Elaine's medications for the day, and brewed exactly one pot of coffee. He tracked their monthly expenses on graph paper with a ruler and a mechanical pencil, ensuring there were no surprises. His pride didn't come from how much he had, but from how well he managed what little was left. In his community, most folks didn't know Walter was a veteran. He wasn't the kind to wear a ball cap embroidered with his unit or line his jacket with pins. His dignity came from within. If someone held the door for him, he nodded in thanks but never lingered. If asked about his past, he'd smile faintly and say, "Just did my part." That's what made the events at the bank so deeply jarring, not just because of the policy or the inconvenience or the cold response of a young teller, but because Walter Briggs, who had lived a life of quiet service and unshakable routine, was being told that his sacrifice, his record, his planning didn't matter. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't have a protocol for what to do next. It was the first Tuesday of the month, just like it had been for years. Rain or shine, Walter Briggs walked the same path from his apartment to the corner branch of New Liberty Bank, a quiet institution nestled between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner. He didn't need GPS reminders or a calendar. His body knew the rhythm. His Army pension landed in his account at 7:02 a.m., and by 9:00, Walter would be standing at the counter to withdraw exactly what he and Elaine needed for the month, no more, no less. Walter wasn't a man of impulse. His monthly withdrawal, $400, covered groceries, co-pays for Elaine's medication, and a little cash for emergencies. He didn't trust cards or mobile apps, not because he didn't understand them, but because he'd seen systems fail. The physical feel of a $20 bill in his wallet gave him a quiet kind of certainty that numbers on a screen never could. That morning started like any other. He wore his olive field jacket zipped halfway. A small notepad rested in his chest pocket, listing what he needed to pick up at the store after the bank. Elaine had struggled through the night, her breath shallow, strained, and her specialist had just prescribed a new inhaler. Walter didn't say it out loud, but he knew this visit to the bank mattered more than most. That new medication wasn't optional. He stepped inside New Liberty Bank, greeted the scent of freshly brewed lobby coffee, and made his way to the counter. But instead of the usual teller Margaret, a woman in her 50s who always smiled and asked about Elaine, there stood a young man with stiff posture and a colder tone. His name tag read, Travis. Walter gave him a polite nod and slid his withdrawal slip and ID across the counter. Morning. I'd like to withdraw $400 from my account, he said calmly. Travis didn't respond right away. He was already typing. His eyes didn't meet Walter's. The young man muttered, frowning at the screen. Looks like there's a temporary hold on your account, sir. Walter straightened slightly. A hold. My pension came in this morning, same as always. Yes, sir, I do see the deposit. Travis replied, still not looking up. But the system flagged it for an automatic security hold. Could be routine. Could be part of last night's processing update. Walter blinked. What does that mean I can't access my money? Not until the hold is cleared, Travis said flatly. It's part of our fraud prevention protocols. Nothing I can override here. Walter's hands tightened on the edge of the counter. This isn't a suspicious wire transfer. This is a pension I've received for decades. My wife needs her medication today. Travis shrugged. I understand, sir. I really do. But I'm not authorized to bypass system locks. Without missing a beat, he reached under the counter and slid over a trifold pamphlet with a customer service number printed on the back in small type. You can call this line. They might be able to explain more. Walter stared at the brochure, then back at Travis. No apology, no options, just policy. That's when he realized the system didn't care how many years he'd served or how urgent this morning truly was, and neither did Travis. Walter's hand trembled slightly as he placed the useless brochure on the counter. He didn't want to make a scene. That wasn't his way, but there was too much at stake for silence. My wife, he said, his voice low, but steady, needs that medication today. She has advanced lung disease. The doctor prescribed a new inhaler. It cost nearly $400 up front. I'm not asking for a loan. I'm asking for my own money. Travis finally looked up, but only briefly. His face remained expressionless, as if he'd been trained not to absorb emotion. I understand your concern, sir. But the system locked the account due to a security flag. It's bank policy. There's nothing I can do from this terminal. Walter stared at him. Bank policy, he echoed. Travis nodded, already moving on to the next screen. You're welcome to wait for the hold to lift. Usually clears within 48 business hours. That could mean 4 actual days, Walter said, his voice tightening. She doesn't have 4 days. I'm sorry, Travis replied automatically, though there was no sorrow in his tone. He motioned toward the waiting area. You can sit there if you'd like to call the helpline. I'm afraid that's all I can offer. Walter took a slow breath. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the counter or demand a supervisor. He just nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. Not with Travis, but with reality. No one was going to help him here. He turned away from the counter and walked slowly to the bench by the entrance. The polished tile floor seemed colder than usual beneath his boots. He sat heavily, elbows on knees, hands clasped loosely. For a long moment he said nothing. He just stared down at the paper brochure in his lap. The font was too small, the colors too cheerful for a man in his situation. He could already picture the endless menu of automated prompts, the 30-minute hold time, the underpaid customer service representative reading from a screen. Policy had replaced people. He closed his eyes, thinking of Elaine, of her thin shoulders rising and falling as she struggled to breathe, of the soft wheeze behind every sentence, of the look in her eyes when she asked if he'd be able to pick up the medication today. Then somewhere deeper in his memory, a name surfaced, a number. It had been years, over a decade, maybe more, since Walter had used it. It was given to him during a joint civilian-military emergency response initiative, back when he'd worked logistics on a national disaster protocol team. A junior officer had handed him a card and said, if there's ever a real failure in the system, something that hurts the people, it's supposed to protect you, call this number. Direct line. Last resort only. At the time, Walter had laughed and tucked the number into his notebook. Now, sitting in that sterile lobby, surrounded by indifference and silence, he reached slowly into his coat pocket and dialed. Walter's fingers hesitated over the keypad. The old flip phone in his hand was scratched and outdated, but dependable like the man who carried it. He opened his worn leather wallet tucked behind a sleeve of grocery receipts and folded notes and slid out a yellowing business card. The ink had faded with time, but one name still stood clear: Graham Kessler, Emergency Liaison, Treasury and Infrastructure, Task Force. It had been nearly 15 years since they'd last spoken. Back then, Walter was part of a nationwide crisis response initiative pairing military logistics officers with civilian infrastructure leaders during disaster simulations. Graham had been one of the youngest participants in the room, a sharp-witted financial analyst with a calm voice and eyes that missed nothing. Despite the age gap, he and Walter had worked well together. They respected the mission and each other. At the end of that exercise, Graham had handed Walter this card and said, "If the system ever fails someone, it shouldn't call me, only if it really matters." Walter had carried the card all these years more out of principle than expectation. Until now. His thumb hovered over the digits as doubt crept in. CEOs didn't answer unknown numbers. People like Graham were insulated behind layers of assistants, gatekeepers, and policy. And yet, something in Walter stirred. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was standing up for what was right for Elaine. He dialed. To his surprise, the call didn't ring more than once. Kessler. The voice on the other end was direct, still calm, still commanding. "Graham, it's Walter. Walter Briggs. Senior Master Sergeant, retired. We served together during Crimson Watch. You gave me a number. Said to call if the system ever." Briggs Kessler cut in. A pause, then recognition cracked through. "Walter Briggs. Good Lord. It's been, what, 15 years? Are you all right?" Walter exhaled, almost forgetting how tightly he'd been holding his breath. "I wouldn't be calling if I were. I'm sitting in the lobby of New Liberty Bank. My pension came in this morning the same way it has for decades, but they froze my account due to some system-wide update. My wife's medication is waiting at the pharmacy, and they won't release it without full payment." Kessler's tone changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by clipped urgency. Which branch? Walter gave the location. He could already hear clicking in the background, fast, deliberate keystrokes. "All right," Kessler said, "I see the flag. That hold was applied by mistake, part of a flawed patch that went live last night. It shouldn't have touched veteran disbursements. This is a failure, not of finance, but of judgment." He paused. "Walter, are you still at the branch?" "Yes, good. Stay where you are. Do not leave. I'm about 7 minutes away." The call ended. Walter closed the phone and stared ahead. The system had failed, but one person still remembered what it meant to serve. The minutes passed like hours. Walter sat quietly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor tiles that reflected the sterile overhead lights. Around him, the world moved on. Customers chatting softly, phones, ringing printers, spitting out paperwork. The bank hummed with normalcy, oblivious to the quiet crisis unfolding in the corner of its lobby. He didn't look up when the front doors opened, but everyone else did. The hiss of the sliding glass was sharper than usual, followed by the unmistakable sound of polished shoes hitting tile with purpose. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Fingers hovered over keyboards. Chairs creaked as heads turned. Walter lifted his eyes. There, framed in the doorway like a storm rolling in, stood Graham Kessler. He hadn't changed much since Walter had last seen him, just older, more refined. The once sharp face now held the kind of stern authority that came not just from title, but from years of making hard decisions. His dark tailored suit fit perfectly every inch of him, exuding command and precision. But it wasn't the clothing that drew attention, it was the expression. Fury. Contained. Cold. Controlled. Graham's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Walter. He walked over without hesitation, extending his hand. "Walter," he said, voice low but firm. "It's good to see you, though. I wish to God it wasn't under these circumstances." Walter stood and shook his hand. "Didn't expect to call in that favor." Graham gave a tight nod. "You didn't. You just reminded me what this place is supposed to stand for." Then, without another word, he turned toward the counter. "Where's the branch manager?" he said, voice rising slightly, not yelling but loud enough to ripple through the room like a snapped flag in the wind. Travis the teller froze behind his screen. She's in a meeting, I think," he stammered. Then interrupted, Graham snapped. Now, the young man blanched. Yes, sir. I'll go get her. Don't bother, Graham added, already striding toward the door marked, Manager, Authorized Personnel Only. Behind him trailed a sharply dressed woman with a clipboard, likely his executive assistant, and a tall, broad man in a black suit who looked more like security than finance. As if on cue, Ms. Delaney appeared from the hallway, her eyes widening as she spotted the CEO of the parent corporation walking straight toward her. Mr. Kessler, she said, flustered. I wasn't expecting no. You weren't, Graham interrupted coldly. And neither was your staff, apparently, because your team just denied a military veteran access to his federally deposited pension for medical needs due to an improperly coded security flag and did absolutely nothing to fix it. She blinked. I only just got back. He didn't wait. Office. Now. Bring the teller. And Mr. Briggs. The next 5 minutes felt like something out of a courtroom drama. Inside the manager's office, Graham remained standing. He didn't need to sit. He owned the room. Ms. Delaney stood awkwardly behind her desk, while Travis lingered by the door, pale and sweating. Walter stood off to the side, silent, his posture straight as ever. Graham began, voice slow and precise. This morning, Mr. Walter Briggs came into this branch to withdraw a portion of his monthly pension money he has rightfully earned through 3 decades of military service. He was told he could not access it due to an automatic system flag. When he explained the urgency that the funds were for his wife's medication, he was handed a brochure. He turned to Travis. Is that correct? Travis swallowed. Yes, sir. That's the policy. I couldn't override the hold. Did you escalate the issue? I didn't know how. I just followed the script. Graham's eyes narrowed. And you, Ms. Delaney, did you train your staff on Directive 7B Paragraph 4, which covers escalation procedures for pension account flags, especially those linked to veteran benefits? She hesitated. I don't recall that section specifically. Then you failed in your duty, he said, cutting her off. You are the gatekeeper of this branch. When your staff doesn't know how to help a man like Walter Briggs, who has given more to this country than most of us ever will, then this bank has failed, not just in service and humanity. He turned back to Walter. Mr. Briggs, your funds are available. Immediately. I've removed the hold personally. Furthermore, the cost of your wife's medication, not just today, but for the next 12 months, will be covered by my discretionary account. It's the very least we can do. Walter's lips parted, slightly stunned. You didn't have to. I absolutely did, Graham said firmly, because all of this is what happens when people hide behind procedure instead of stepping up. Then back to Miss Delaney and Travis. Expect a full audit of this branch's training procedures, and expect to be part of a mandatory retraining program, effective immediately. No one argued, because there was nothing left to say. Walter stood quietly as Graham Kessler turned the tide with a few authoritative phone calls and a presence that demanded attention. Within minutes, the frozen funds were released. The bank's internal system flagged Walter's account as veteran priority, and a red banner across the screen read, Cleared, Immediate Access Authorized by CEO. Ms. Delaney, still visibly shaken, printed the withdrawal slip herself. She didn't sit. She stood respectfully across the counter, her tone softer, now tinged with guilt. I've processed your withdrawal, Mr. Briggs, and I sincerely apologize for this morning. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Walter gave a quiet nod but said nothing. His words had already been spoken, his service already proven. Now the weight of failure rested with those who had failed him. While Ms. Delaney finished the paperwork, Graham stepped back to Walter's side. I meant what I said, he told him in a firm yet respectful tone. Elaine's medication costs, all of them, will be covered for the next 12 months. I've assigned a member of my executive office to handle it personally. You won't deal with automated lines or pamphlets again. Walter raised an eyebrow. That's generous. Graham nodded once. It's justice, and long overdue. The two men stood in silence for a moment. Two soldiers from different wars, different generations, but bound by a shared understanding, some things are earned, not given. By the end of that business day, the story had already spread beyond the branch. Word moved quickly across Liberty Corp Holdings. An internal memo signed directly by Graham Kessler went out to every manager in the network. The subject line was stark and clear. Veterans are not just customers. They are commitments. The message inside was even sharper. Any failure to serve our veteran clients with the highest degree of urgency, respect, and flexibility will be met with immediate corrective action. Veterans are not policy problems. They are the reason this company exists in the country we call home. Any system that cannot adapt to their needs is a system that must be restructured. Staff meetings were called. Emergency retraining modules were drafted. Branch managers across the country opened their inboxes to find a mandatory directive titled 7B Veteran Priority Response Recognition, Escalation, and Resolution. Travis the teller was placed under internal review, not to be punished cruelly, but to be confronted with a lesson he'd never forget about listening, about responsibility, and about what lies beyond the script. He was sent home for 2 weeks and enrolled in a mentorship program under a senior advisor who had served in the Navy. Ms. Delaney, meanwhile, was enrolled in executive retraining and temporarily reassigned to work with Liberty Corp's new Veteran Liaison Department, where she would receive hands-on experience in dealing with vulnerable clients. Walter didn't ask for any of it. He didn't gloat. He simply walked out of the bank $400 in hand and caught the next bus home, where Elaine waited medication, ready at the pharmacy, and a warm meal quietly simmering on the stove. Walter stepped off the city bus just as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the neighborhood sidewalks. The crisp air carried a whisper of winter, but he hardly noticed it. In his left hand was a small white pharmacy bag, simple, unassuming, yet filled with the most important thing he could bring home that day, Elaine's new medication. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, slowly, his legs weary but steady. It had been a long day, not physically but emotionally. The quiet indignity of being brushed aside, the helplessness of sitting in that lobby, the unexpected force of a single phone call that had changed everything. It all still buzzed faintly in his chest. Inside the apartment was as he'd left it. Tidy, modest, home. Elaine was in her usual chair by the window, a blanket over her legs, the oxygen tube gently hissing beside her. She looked up as he walked in, eyes immediately darting to the bag in his hand. "You got it?" she asked softly. "I got it," he said, walking over to hand it to her. She didn't smile wide, she didn't have the strength for that anymore, but her eyes lit with quiet relief. Walter could see it, feel it, and it was enough. "What happened at the bank?" she asked after a moment, her voice more curious than concerned. He paused. "They made it right," he replied simply. And that was all he said. She didn't push. After 42 years together, she knew when to ask and when to let silence speak. That evening, they ate a small dinner. Elaine took her first dose of the new medication, and for the first time in several nights, drifted into sleep without a coughing fit. Walter sat beside her, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, the rhythm of peace restored at least for now. The next morning, he woke early as always, made coffee, read the paper, and saw it. A headline on a business news site: Liberty Corp launches Veteran Priority Access Program after CEO responds to mishandled case. The article explained how a new policy had been enacted across every branch of the bank, one that included a direct hotline for veteran clients, faster escalation protocols, and specialized training for staff on how to handle federal disbursements like pensions and benefits. Every employee would be required to complete a course in veteran sensitivity and emergency response by the end of the quarter. No names were mentioned, no headlines screamed about Walter Briggs, and that was just fine by him. He hadn't wanted attention. He hadn't fought for glory. He had only wanted to take care of his wife and for the system to recognize that his service, like that of millions of others, was not just a number in a file. Sitting there in his kitchen, the steam rising from his chipped mug, he thought about how rare it was for someone in power to actually act, not after a lawsuit, not after media outrage, but because it was simply the right thing to do. Not everyone had a Graham Kessler to call. Not every veteran had a contact at the top of the food chain, and that was what weighed on Walter the most. How many others had been denied and had no one listening? How many walked away from those same counters feeling invisible, unheard, and unworthy of urgency? The change sparked by one moment, by one man refusing to accept policy as an excuse, wouldn't fix everything. But it was a start, a small reminder that systems, for all their automation and structure, are still run by people. And sometimes it takes just one person standing up to make them remember what it means to serve. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a frozen bank account or a late medication. It was about something much deeper, about how easily a system built for convenience can forget compassion. About how someone who gave everything for his country could be told there's nothing we can do by someone reading from a script. Walter Briggs never raised his voice. He never demanded special treatment, and yet his quiet dignity spoke louder than any protest. He reminded us of a lesson we often forget in today's fast-moving world. True respect is shown not in grand gestures, but in how we treat people when they're at their most vulnerable. In modern America, many of us rely on technology, policy, and speed. But when those things replace empathy, we lose something far more valuable. That's especially true for older adults and veterans, people who built the very foundation we now stand on. So here's our question to you. Have you ever seen someone mistreated by a system that forgot their humanity? Do you believe companies should be held more accountable when they fail people who serve this nation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's learn from each other. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of a parent, a neighbor, or even yourself, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for spending time with us today. Because sometimes the smallest stories reveal the biggest truths, and sometimes they remind us that even when systems fail, people still have the power to stand up and do what's right.